Thank you, Lawrence. I'm actually a coal miner's great-granddaughter, and as it will shortly be revealed, I'm a preacher's daughter, and I think the latter has had a lot of influence on my speaking style. So those of you paying attention to the program will notice that I'm part of a BLT that's being served up by CGD in today's program. The B was the great talk on Brazil's experience with deforestation and controlling it by Arturo as the first talk of the day. I'm providing you some light lunch fare, hopefully easily digestible. And the last speaker of the day will be my colleague Jonah Bush, who will get us into the more technical issues related to finance and forests and climate change. So between the three of us, the BLT, we hope that you will come away knowing a bit more and having some questions about the role that forests should play in any climate finance agenda. And we very much hope that you will convey those questions to us, because as Lawrence mentioned, we are right at the beginning of a new research program, and what you want to know more about or what you're not convinced by can help us shape our research agenda going forward. So, why forests? So, when I was transiting through the Singapore airport back in June, you couldn't see the plane parked at the terminal in the next bay over. I was kind of surprised the airport was still open. And the reason that the haze was so thick was because this was what was happening in the peat swamps of Sumatra and Kalimantan. So this is what it looks like when a peat swamp is burning. And what I like about this slide is that it conveys not only, a sense of the significance of the emissions that come from forests, but also the co-benefits that can be realized in terms of keeping airports open and keeping the heavy particulate loads out of the lungs, not only of transit passengers like me, but people who have to live in such places year-round. Former colleague of mine at C4 did a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation and figured that the estimated emissions from the 1997 forest fires in Indonesia were about the same as about half of the annual increment to global forest emissions in that year. So these are globally significant emissions. This was the pie chart back in 2007 from the IPCC fourth assessment report that got the world jumping up and down again about tropical forests. Remember, people were jumping up and down back in the first Rio conference, and then interest kind of tailed off. But then tropical forests were rediscovered because, as the green wedge shows, they were arguably 17.4% of the problem. And as was illuminated in the eponymous Stern review by Nick Stern, more than all the planes, trains, and automobiles combined globally. So more from the forestry sector, from the global transport sector. Now, I'm going to give you a warning. The IPCC fifth assessment report will be coming out in the spring with new estimates and probably a new pie chart that looks like this. The green wedge for forests will quite likely be significantly smaller. And what I urge you to do is not conclude that, we've solved the deforestation problem, we can walk away from that, but know that there are reasons for that decreased wedge. Only a tiny bit of the reason is a decrease in total deforestation, and a lot of that is thanks to what's been being done in Brazil that we heard about this morning. Part of the reason is because the whole pie is getting bigger, which is not good news, and the forestry share, therefore, gets smaller. It's the denominator issue. But part of the reason is that we're getting better at estimating the carbon sequestered by regrowth, and so that will be higher, which means that the net is smaller, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot about the gross, which is really important. So for all those reasons, take the decrease in the pie wedge in the next report with a grain of salt. So this is a chart put together by a member of our team inferring from a 2011 UNEP report what the relative shares across sectors of abatement potential would be, taking the means that expert groups estimate of the ranges that expert groups estimated for all the different sectors. And you'll see that, again, forestry comes out here at about 17% of near-term abatement potential. But I would argue that this is likely to be a significant underestimate of the role that forests should play in any financing regime. One, it's likely to be much more significant in developing countries. This is global abatement opportunities. But if we limit our attention to transfers, the forests are going to be a much bigger slice of that. In Indonesia, for example, forests and peatlands are, upwards of 80% of the emissions profile and 87% in the government's own strategy of abatement plans. So much bigger from that sense. Also likely to be among the cheapest slices of the pie. The mean for this exercise was $38 a ton, and a lot of deforestation can be reduced for a lot cheaper than that. Also, you don't need new technology to address this agenda. I think it was the Prime Minister of Norway was fond of saying you don't need new technology to not cut down a tree. So converse to some of the other options, we don't need new technology. Another reason is that the forestry agenda is time sensitive. Once a forest is gone, it takes a really long time to get that forest back, that carbon back into the landscape. And frankly, one area of technology that we don't have yet is how to restore a peatland ecosystem once it's been drained and burned. We actually don't know how to do that, and that is a globally significant source of carbon emissions. And finally, as I'll discuss at some length, there are a lot of other reasons to protect the forests from a development perspective, with many different kinds of co-benefits that I'll illustrate a few of for you today. Now, one question that you may have is, well, yes, okay, a lot of emissions from forests, but isn't protecting forests going to prevent countries from developing, and won't it particularly hurt the poor? Because isn't it those poor people who are cutting down the forest in order to make a living and feed themselves? How can we protect the forests and not, constrain the development options of those communities? And in fact, it's a really, really important question, and Ken Chomitz over at the World Bank wrote a whole book about 6 years ago. It was called At Loggerheads, assessing all of the research on the relationship between deforestation and poverty. And of course, the answer, like most things in life, is it depends. And in some cases, you have win-win options. Sometimes you have lose-lose, and sometimes there are trade-offs. But Ken concluded that book by saying he saw a significant arbitrage opportunity of marrying the low-benefit forest conversion that was going on with the need for industrialized countries to find less expensive carbon abatement opportunities, and was proposing essentially a global payment for environmental services scheme that we now talk about as REDD. And I must say, and I think this is in contravention to something that was said earlier this morning, in fact, that poor people are the main cause of deforestation is increasingly a convenient untruth. While it's hard to attribute deforestation to exclusive causes, mutually exclusive causes, because there's a lot of intertwining, in fact, I would say globally only about 30 to 40% of deforestation could be attributed to smallholder, chipping away at the frontier. And in fact, the 60 to 70% globally, and certainly by far the most in the Amazon basin and Southeast Asia, are land use changes that look like this. These are commercial-scale developments of agribusiness crops such as palm oil, soybean, fast-growing timber to feed the pulp and paper mills, cattle industry, those kinds of land use changes. So it's not the smallholder chipping away at the forest edge, but in fact large-scale land clearing for agribusiness. And that's not all. A lot of the product produced by this agribusiness doesn't stay at home. It is being exported to global markets. So for example, Indonesia, which is now the world's largest producer of palm oil, exports something like 80% of that. And the European Commission just published a so-called forest footprint report back in the summer that estimated that from 1990 to 2008, Europe's consumption was responsible for about 8% of tropical deforestation because of the deforestation embodied in all the different products that were imported. I would say if that analysis were brought up to date, it would be even much higher because in the intervening interval, the EU imports of palm oil, in part driven by in my view, perverse policy-created demand for biodiesel, which has displaced vegetable oils, out of the market, has been drawing this product into Europe. So some of this is artificially created demand for the products that are being grown at expense of forests. So what else do we lose other than sequestered carbon when a landscape is transformed from a tropical forest or peatland into another use? Well, sometimes we hear talk about, well, we got to sacrifice the forests in order to feed the poor. Well, actually, forests actually provide a fair amount of food security to the poor right now. Bushmeat in the Congo Basin, in the rural areas, estimated to supply up to 80% of proteins and fats in local diets. Another back-of-the-envelope calculation is that the bushmeat produced by the forests of the Congo Basin is, on a ton per year basis, on the same order of magnitude as the beef produced by the Amazon Basin. And yet you get that protein without converting to pastures and emitting all those climate emissions. So it's a pretty productive ecosystem now. On the right side is an example of products from dry forests. So this would be typical of the West African forests. And the women are carrying a seed pod that's gathered from the forest to be used as forage, so direct input to subsistence livelihoods. But that's not all. Forests also produce quite a bit of rural income, cash income, and employment that can help people buy food and other needs. In a lot of places, the informal logging sector is an important source of income and employment. You see women get a lot of employment from gathering non-timber forest products and also in the processing parts of the supply chain. Charcoal and wood fuel, very big in sub-Saharan Africa, is one of the most significant forest products. So you're asking, what is that 21% she's got in there? Well, watch this space. In early 2014, a special issue of World Development will be published that will report the outcome of household surveys over a year's time in some 8,000 households scattered across 27 countries in the tropics. This was a global study done by colleagues at C4. And they have come up with the magic number, which is that on average across all of these households that are in or near forests, about 21% of their annual household income comes from foraged, wild products from the forest. And if you add the foraged wild products from other ecosystems like grasslands or shrublands, it gets up to about 28%, which is about the same as their income from cultivated agricultural crops. Almost all of that income is invisible to policymakers. It's not captured in survey instruments like the LSMS of the World Bank. So just remember that this is what we're losing in terms of livelihood when a forest is converted to another use. So it's not a zero-sum trade-off. But what else do we lose in addition to the livelihood benefits? These are some of the benefits that forests provide at the landscape scale, and contributions to functioning ecosystems, and particularly agroecosystems. I think it has been mentioned before, the functioning of a forested watershed in keeping the Julia's hydroelectric dams from silting up too quickly. But we also have moderation of local climate, keeping the rivers running during dry seasons, keeping the forests from burning during particularly dry and hot seasons, preventing landslides, pollination services, and some very interesting, emerging, but still controversial research that forests can affect climate on a landscape scale in the sense of the evapotranspiration from forests actually creating the clouds that provide the rainfall in the breadbasket areas of continents such as Brazil's. So it reminds me of Lawrence's opening about Ezekiel, depending on the rain. Well, if we're still depending on the rain, we might want to preserve the forest. The other point I want to make about this is all of these services become increasingly important for adaptation, because everything we know about the climate models are that rainfall events will become more severe, causing more landslides, flooding. Droughts will become longer and hotter, leading to the increased importance of hydrological functions and rain-creating functions of forests. And I would put to you that another reason to give a healthy share of any climate finance available to forests is that it's one of the few sectors where what you do for adaptation and mitigation are more or less the same thing. If you want more mitigation from forests, you protect the natural forest cover. If you want more adaptation from forests, you protect the natural forest cover. Now, where you do it may vary depending on where the carbon is versus where the vulnerability is, but the co-benefits in either way are likely to be quite significant. So it's one of the few buy one, get two, buy one, get one free in climate finance. So, to the politics. All of this came to a head at COP13 in Bali, where the idea of an international arbitrage opportunity was embodied in a concept called REDD, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. That has consistently been one of the most productive areas of negotiation in the global climate negotiations. There's something for everybody. From the industrialized countries' perspective, it gives the potential for a low-cost emissions abatement option to, offset emissions in the developed world with lower-cost emissions that are available immediately without technology, buy some time for the more difficult emissions reductions at home. From the perspective of developing countries, potentially significant source of additional development finance. Conservationists loved it because, this is another source of political will and finance for saving the forests, for the biodiversity, which I haven't even mentioned yet, as well as all the ecosystem services, and done right, also a constituency from the rural development crowd, because if you could get the payments to the rural communities, it would provide an additional source of income to the communities that are actually serving as stewards of the forest. So it was a great moment to be in forestry because it was all coming together and a really area of agreement. Okay, so if this is such a great idea, and I'm going to make the argument why now, you might be asking, well, why not yet? Why hasn't this already happened? Well, Copenhagen happened. And a lot of the energy behind REDD was premised on the unleashing of large-scale finance from north to south, whether based on a cap-and-trade compliance regime or other mechanisms, to put significant money behind this agenda that would incentivize the forest country governments to do what they needed to do to protect the forests and leave the trees in the ground. And so this is the main reason why this hasn't yet happened, and the main reason why forests need to be an important piece of any new climate finance. I'll say more about that in a minute. It is true that there were at the beginning and continue to be some legitimate concerns about the feasibility of REDD on the technical side, defining reference emission levels and monitoring systems that could help get it right. Also some concerns on the social side, potential unintended negative consequences. I mean, in the past, when something valuable has been found in a forest, it's the local people who get pushed aside so that national and international elites can grab it. How can we be sure that that's not going to happen with REDD? So there's some safeguard issues as well. But I think it's fair to say that the failure to come forward or have the prospect of significant finance that really, receded on the horizon after Copenhagen is the main reason that the agenda has slowed. Now, the second reason is that in the context of national level implementation is maybe cheap, but it's not easy. And there are significant political adjustment costs to make this happen. So, stylized picture here about what you can do in a landscape with forests. This is a palm oil plantation under construction in central Kalimantan. So what tends to be happening now is that if you want to expand your plantation, you would expand into the forest because that is the easiest thing for you to do. And in fact, you may even get a windfall profit from carting off the timber that is felled in the clearing of the forest. The second easiest thing to do would be to expand into a low-carbon landscape at the top of the slide where it's already been deforested, but actually that turns out to be problematic because if an area has already been cleared, somebody else probably has a claim on it, and then you get into these sticky negotiations with local communities, and gosh, who needs that? So people tend not to do that. And then the third option would be to intensify cultivation and raise productivity in areas that are already cultivated to meet demand in that way. Now, a panelist this morning said, oh, yes, the answer to the Brazil story has been agricultural intensification. They've invested in agricultural research and raised productivity on existing land. It's partially true. It is certainly necessary to raise productivity on existing cultivated lands to have that outcome. But we've known from research from 15 years that it's not sufficient unless you establish a frontier in the forest to create incentives to not do the easy thing to expand in the forest and do the harder thing to invest in intensification. So I would argue it's definitely a both and. And that brings us to the good governance issue. I believe it was Artur who said in his comments that we needed to get the prices right. Well, actually, in red, the most important thing is getting the institutions and governance right. And that turns out to be really difficult and time-consuming. So a new study that will be coming out later this year will show that a lot of this commercial scale land clearing that I was referring to earlier is in fact illegal. It's done without the necessary permits, and there was an alert from WRI just yesterday saying that their analysis shows that a lot of the recent forest fires in June in Indonesia were actually taking place not only within concessions or in peatlands, places where it's not supposed to happen, but inside national parks, right? So this is a real governance issue with a lot of illegality attached to it that's really difficult to address, in part because these rent captures are very much integrated into national political economies. You know, there are very strong vested interests who would like to see business as usual continue. And so again, referring to those, you know, adjustment costs, it's going to take some political courage to do what needs to be done. On the other side of the picture, we have evidence from around the world that local communities, when, you know, given the right support systems and secure land tenure, which was brought up earlier this morning by John Lewis, local communities do a pretty good job, and in fact often a better job than governments in protecting the forest. And yet, in order to empower them to do that requires massive structural changes to change property rights regimes to recognize those local community rights. So for example, in Indonesia now, you know, 70% of the forest is still under the Ministry of Forestry state control, but I would argue that a recent Constitutional Court decision in May recognizing indigenous peoples' claims over the forest, trumping those of the Ministry of Forestry, probably wouldn't have happened without all of the discourse associated with RED. So, what's the argument for why now? I'm going to give you 4. First of all, the technology has advanced to the point where we can monitor what's going on in forests and measure the changes in carbon stocks and flows better than ever before. So on the left, you see an image that is made possible by MODIS satellite images, where on a cycle of 16 days, you can see where there are deforestation events happening with a reasonable accuracy. It's very high temporal resolution and good enough spatial resolution. And so this is the kind of technology that the Brazilians use to actually mobilize law enforcement efforts as part of the package of interventions that Artur was telling us about this morning that led to a decrease in the deforestation rate. On the right, we see Landsat imagery, which is the technology and the ability to analyze that technology and overlay the scenes has enabled us better than ever before to measure the changes on an annual basis of how much deforestation and regrowth has taken place. So as the basis of a monitoring system and potentially a payment for performance system. But I would argue that the value of this new technology goes above and beyond that sort of technical utility for making a RED system work. It's actually catalyzing shifts in governance norms. I mean, basically, now that you have this eye in the sky, and as C4 did, this is an image from a recent C4 blog, you know, sort of trace out where the concessions are, you know, based on the polygons and the satellite imagery, there's no place to hide. And so there's now increasing pressure on governments to disclose the information they have, not only about forest covering condition, but who has the rights, you know, where are the concession boundaries according to their records, which up to now have not been public documents, that allow for a more open, you know, citizen enforcement approach to keeping the bad guys on the straight and narrow. A second reason is the Brazil story, and this is just a different version of the map that Artur showed you this morning about the deforestation rate over time, and you can see a dramatic fall starting at about 2004. These are images from Paulo Barreto at Amazon. And what's interesting is when you overlay the soy and cattle price index with that, because for a while there people were saying, oh, well, the only reason that the Brazilians are reducing deforestation is that commodity prices are low, and as soon as they go back up again, the deforestation is going to go up too. Well, in fact, you can see that Brazil has succeeded in decoupling the deforestation rate from those commodity prices. Third reason why now is that a lot of people got dressed up and went to the altar at the Bali COP. And a lot of these red early movers, ranging from heads of state down to villagers, thought the international community was going to, deliver on this promise. And so they've invested a great deal in terms of personal political capital or investment in planning or deferring other land use decisions, getting ready for red. So you had President Yudhoyono of Indonesia being the first developing country leader to step forward and make some ambitious commitments to reduce emissions, and most of those were going to be coming from reduced emissions from deforestation. Calderon spoke at an event in Cancun where he departed from his prepared remarks and was pounding on the pulpit, talking about the underlying drivers of deforestation. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. But we had heads of state really putting their imprimatur on this. And again, as I say, a lot of local communities as well. Well, these guys have been waiting around for 6 years now. And a former Red negotiator has characterized this as a narrative of disappointment gradually setting in. And I think there's a rapidly closing window to turn that narrative around before it will be sufficiently sunk in that it will be very difficult to change. The fourth reason is that we have an opportunity, and this is where this new project at Center for Global Development comes in, to marry two areas of analysis and experience that remarkably have not come together before. And that is all the work that Center for Global Development and others have done on this cash-on-delivery aid approach, a payment for performance approach in other sectors like education and health delivery. And then on the other side, all of the research that's gone into trying to figure out how RED would work. Well, both have the same challenges. How do you set a baseline? How do you measure progress? What are the payment modalities? All that stuff. Some of them are going to be easier in other sectors. Some of them are going to be harder. But there's plenty to learn between the two. And we're going to make it our business to try to draw those lessons out. So I see that as a real opportunity. Now, one of the lessons that I would argue that has emerged from both camps is consistent with something that Arvind said this morning, which is that it's not really about the money. And what I would argue is that it's about the framing. These two images, I think, say it all. The top image is the famous, this is a tale of two LOIs. So the top image is the image of Kamdasu when he was head of the IMF standing over President Suharto's shoulder as President Suharto signed the LOI with the IMF that was the bailout in the 1998 financial crisis. This image, it turns out that in Indonesian culture, this is really rude. And so the Indonesian public found this profoundly humiliating and frankly to this day have a grudge against the bank and the IMF because of this framing of the bailout package of the LOI. Contrast this with the framing of the signing of the more recent LOI, a letter of intent with the Kingdom of Norway, on a $1 billion deal, payment for performance, in which the two heads of state are standing together as equals. So the framing of this as an equal partnership, a business transaction, and not a donor-recipient transaction, I would argue, has made all the difference. Now, it doesn't mean, so when I agree with Arvind that it's not about the financial transfers, nevertheless, that $1 billion, as trivial as it was in the context of the Indonesian economy, made a huge symbolic difference. So I'll close by saying it's not about the money, but we still need the money to make all this happen. Thank you very much. I welcome your questions. Guess I should have planted one. Oh, yes, Billy.
I'll ask. I mean, let me just see if I interpret what you just said correctly. You couldn't pay for all the reductions you're going to get in some sense, but you could catalyze the government to make the policy changes that need to be made. So it's like giving a little something, but they've really got to do all the hard work themselves. Is that?
That's exactly right.
The gist of it. Okay.
That's right. It's a pay, I think Nancy would call it payment, buying down some of the adjustment costs, and some of those adjustment costs are political costs, and it's easier to defy the pulp and paper industry, when you've got something else on the other side of the scale. It's not by any means going to be a dollar for dollar, compensation, but it helps empower, and also in the Indonesia case, by placing responsibility for this agenda in the president's office, it provided a counterweight to the lot that the Ministry of Forestry had on this, and just opened up. It was really a tectonic shift in the political economy and discourse about forests in the Indonesian economy. So it made a really significant difference. And as an observer of forestry in Indonesia for the last 30 years, and let me assure you, billions of dollars of aid has been delivered to Indonesia in the interest of reducing deforestation with very little results to show for it. But this made a difference.
That $1 billion, how much has actually been delivered based on the milestones achieved? Sorry.
The phase 1 was just completed last month. I'm kind of looking at Andreas here to give me some numbers, because he's been living and breathing this for the last several years. And it was on the order of 2 to 3% of the $1 billion that had been expended on readiness. 40 million, total of 40 million. So I think 30 million for some of the initial planning and MRV capacity building and that sort of thing. And another 9 million has just been allocated as sort of transitional into phase 2. And later this afternoon, Jonah's going to give us a tutorial on the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of RED implementation. None of the payment for performance money per se has yet been transferred. There is not yet payment for performance. So far, it's all just some of the upfront readiness costs. I saw your hand first.
Yeah, I just had a question. Other than Norway, has signed? Sorry, other than Norway, who's out there who's keen on the pay for performance in this area?
This afternoon, Jonah's going to give you a slide that sort of gives a quick tutorial of which those are. The Germans have a RED Early Movers program that is active in Acre in making payments. The others are much smaller sort of pilot sort of efforts, and nobody has stepped up to the scale that the Norwegians have. Please.
Well, thank you for this very informative speech. We always dream the world with many more Norways. As you know, that there have been a lot of discussions about using carbon market to deliver payments to RED projects or programs. And I think the challenge has been always said how you use a market-based instrument to a sector that, as you have indicated, does not really respond to price signal. So I'd like to just ask you, the World Bank has a carbon fund under the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. So just your views about the carbon market for RED.
Well, first let me say that it's been one of the controversial areas in the RED global negotiations, because there have been very vocal elements of some governments, and I guess notably Bolivia, and significant parts of civil society who I would almost say have sort of an ideological opposition to the use of carbon markets for RED, in part because they feel like it sort of lets the industrialized countries off the hook, but also because of what I think are legitimate concerns about how a carbon market could function, as you suggest, in this particular area. But my own sense is that we don't have to answer all of those questions before moving ahead with performance-based finance, because that doesn't require all of the same architecture for a functioning market. I don't know if Jonah wants to say more about that, or Ruben. I mean, other people in the room have focused more on this particular question than I have. Jonah?
Thank you. Jonah Bush, research fellow at Center for Global Development. I just think that there will be forest countries that are not interested in markets. There will be forest countries that are interested in markets. There will be rich countries buying RED that are interested in markets. There are rich countries buying RED that are not interested in markets. And so you can draw lines and find systems that work of any of those pairs. And so when a country like Bolivia says we're not interested in markets, that's fine. They can go to a UN RED, which is getting money from countries that will support that. I remember very clearly representative of 37 or so coalition of rainforest nations standing up and saying, that works for you. We want markets. We won't tell you you have to have them. Don't tell us we can't have them. And so you'll see them going to rich countries that are also comfortable with markets and making that transaction happen.
Yeah, John, your hand's been up.
As you know, we work in market red and buyers of market red, and we actually sold some Cambodia red 2 weeks ago, thanks to a little help from our OPIC backers. But they're not sure about jurisdictional red, and a lot of the deal on this. Now, performance is performance, so whatever works, but the buyers don't think jurisdictional red has the kind of decentralized governance and the thing I mentioned earlier, which is, of course, genuine land tenure security, without which development, economic growth does not happen. And this is the political football. And so the first question, you get these corporate buyers who, aren't anthropologists like me. They don't necessarily haven't been trained. They went to Wharton or something. They weren't trained to care about the little guy. And they say, what are the community? What are the villages getting? What are the women getting? What are the little people? What are the landless getting? Are there landless people there? They're asking all these, if you will, development kinds of questions, because it's all about risk, because they want to go into the secondary risk market. And yet we have the same jurisdictional red process at the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility going in the other direction, which is more comforting. We talk about these countries and their governments as if they're the same thing. And if they were the same thing, they wouldn't be so poor.
I don't think that was a question, so I'm going to keep going around. Nancy?
So, Francis, I was very taken by the comment that Arturo made this morning about the Germans having started 2 or 3 decades ago to build up capability, technical and other, in Brazil, and that's hard of Brazil's success. So, if you had your druthers in the next 3 to 5 years, which you won't have, none of us will, but forest money, how much would you put into the pay for performance pot, and how much into the building capability pot? And if you could answer that question in the light of the Congo and other countries that are not where Brazil and even Indonesia are on governance, that would be interesting too.
I think the project that we have put before us for the next 2 years and the working group to look at what can we learn from COD aid for forests is designed to answer that question. Because when I read your book about, where does COD aid work, and one of the propositions is, well, actually it could be the best answer in some of the more fragile and poorly performing states. That challenged my view that, you couldn't do this in the Congo Basin for a while because you don't have the capacity. So there's a chicken and egg thing about whether the payment for performance incentive induces the kind of capacity building that's needed to, do what needs to be done, or risks doing a lot of harm. And I think we don't know the answer to that question. So I would prefer to say, ask me in 2 years, and I'll give you a number. But I suspect that it will be different in different countries. I think I agree with Arturo that the investment in capacity can be a very good investment, and the question is the degree to which that investment in capacity can translate into stronger institutions and more progressive governance norms. Because certainly part of the success story in Brazil was strong civil society that had its own satellite imagery analysis and, could challenge the government. And again, that's what I was talking about before, this sort of upwardly leveraging of transparency, which in turn has a political dynamic and, helps lead to the decrease in deforestation. I doubt that civil society, for example, in the Congo Basin countries is sufficiently well developed to be able to replicate that right away. But there may be some ways, as Arthur suggested, that we could accelerate that development based on the Brazil and other experiences. So there was one more hand in the back, and then I think we may be out of time.
My name's Alan I work for the World Bank on climate change. I used to work for the Australian government, and I can echo the lessons of framework and governance for multi-million-dollar aid programs in Indonesia that have learnt the same lessons. My question relates to IPCC science that I'm probably going to misquote, that the world needs to become a net sink within this century in order to avoid the most dangerous effects of climate change, and that's in a scenario even when there's ambitious emissions reductions. My question related to that is, do you think that forests could provide enough of a sink to help achieve that? And if not, are the constraints more biological or governance or financial?
I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, although my colleague Jens, has been looking into this literature just in the last few days, is shaking his head vigorously. In fact, that what I was saying in that early slide about the wedge for forests, getting smaller, and one of the reasons for that being better numbers about regrowth, suggests that there is more potential than we thought in terms of the sequestration role of forests. And I remember there was a big paper that came out about 3 or 4 years ago challenging conventional wisdom that mature forests sort of stopped sequestering carbon after a certain point, that in fact, based on some pretty good data from Central Africa, in fact, these mature forests are continuing to sequester and a globally significant amount. So my sense is that as the science gets better, the role of forests in providing sinks becomes more important. Arturo, I'll give you the last word.
Francis, my question, first one comment that for us, the contribution of Norway, as you showed in that picture of Indonesia, has the same kind of motivational incentive, let's say. Some people criticize that the Amazon Fund is not really disbursing the resources, and there are some discussions on the possibility of Norway to use these contributions to consider in their mitigation efforts, since the money is not being disbursed. But the principle behind that is a payment for results, and results that were shown before. It would be more or less like a DPL or a P4R in the World Bank, these instruments where you first recognize that something has been done, and then you pay, and you are not really too much concerned on where you're going to use the money. Nevertheless, we are trying to change the logic of the fund in order to connect more to create incentives for the states and municipalities and also communities to keep the efforts in reducing deforestation. So my question to you would be, how do you see the payment for results approach in the forest sector evolving on these problems that we are seeing now? Of course, when you compare the Amazon Fund to the Forest Investment Program nowadays, you don't think it's moving so slow as people used to think. But how do you see this is going to evolve based on the experience we had till now?
Well, I think a mistake that Red World made early on was putting too much emphasis on individual projects, and financing this little intervention in this place and this little intervention in this place, that didn't collectively add up to dealing with those major structural political economy challenges that had to be dealt with in order to change the game on deforestation. Which is why I thought, the FIP, because it in its articles of founding talks about transformational change. I'm not sure we're seeing that yet, but what I see in the Amazon Fund model, it's that initial commitment that helps provide the catalyst for the transformational change. I think Brazil was already pretty far down the road. Indonesia is maybe a better case of really providing a new political opening that wasn't there before. And then the financing, use of the finance to do other good things is sort of icing on the cake. It's like the money is serving two purposes. The first was sort of the political symbolic adjustment cost function, and then the allocating them to red relevant projects is sort of an additional benefit. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your excellent questions and look forward to continuing the dialogue.